Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Vanshika Saraf, research analyst with the Geostrategy program. This month, we saw the third ministerial meeting of the India-EU Trade and Technology Council. It sought to move the TTC towards cooperation on strategic value chains and stronger business participation between India and the EU. Some of the outcomes included negotiations on India's association with Horizon Europe, a startup partnership, an innovation hub for electric vehicle charging, and joint research in marine pollution, renewable hydrogen, and battery recycling. There was another less visible development with the Indian president visiting Moldova, Romania, and North Macedonia. These are countries that do not immediately come to mind when one imagines Europe. Hence, it is instructive to look at this engagement. To discuss this and more, I am in conversation today with my colleague Shobhankita Reddy. Shobhankita, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Vanshika.
Thank you. Let's start by discussing the EU-India Trade and Technology Council, Shobhankita. I know you've written about it, and it's been about 3 years since the TTC was established. Can you give us a broad overview of what's been happening, how it has evolved in the past 3 years?
Yeah. So this was started in April 2022. That was when it was first announced. And obviously, the idea was against the backdrop of increasing geopolitical tensions. India and EU need more space for diplomatic negotiations, economic and technological collaborations, and eventually try to push towards a multipolar world, which is in both parties' interests. And obviously, this is the first such council that India is a part of. For the EU, this is the second in the sense that EU already has such TTC with the US. And the idea eventually is to take forward the interest of strategic autonomy and also improve investments, cooperations for bilateral relationships. So that's really what this entire TTC is about. And there are three working groups that are a part of this TTC. So it's strategic technologies and connectivity, green and clean energy technologies, trade, investments, and value chains. So these are three separate working groups that are a part of the TTC. I think what's important to note is that things have been moving very slowly. So there is, in the last 3 years, meetings, and you can see, the joint statements that have come out of these meetings. But I think the takeaway broadly is that there's been a lot of talk, but not really that much momentum. In general, I think both of us will agree that India and EU have bureaucratic mechanisms that are quite slow, and obviously change is expected to also be slow. And so we see how, there's a little bit of that paralysis going on. And also part of the push towards all of these mechanisms and also the broader alignment, or at least, the recent FTA with India obviously provides a major, massive push in terms of increasing that momentum for increasing options for both players. But at the end of the day, this relationship is tainted by the transatlantic relationship in the sense that isn't ruptured but frayed, and that has caused Europe to look for other options, right? Vis-a-vis also other countries, Japan, South Korea, so on and so forth. So I think the reality is that geopolitical tensions today necessitate that India and EU come together. They are like-minded partners. They are like-minded in so many ways, and they also want to balance big powers, which is US and China. That's really the backdrop to this momentum vis-a-vis the FTA, and obviously the Trade and Technology Council was started as like a mini experiment towards that. But I would say in terms of outcomes, it's still slow and change has been slow. You mentioned Horizon Europe, and I do want to talk about that because that sometimes ends up taking a lot of headspace in news and media out of these negotiations, because Horizon Europe is the European Union's flagship research and innovation funding program. And they have a budget which is actually the largest publicly funded R&D program in the world. turns out about 93 billion euros. That's the kind of budget they have, and 5 to 6 year time period. And a bunch of countries that are non-EU associated can also be partner countries and member states to this. And this includes the United Kingdom, Norway, Canada, and India is not a partner or an associated member of Horizon Europe. And the reason is that India has not yet agreed to commit to the financial pool that this budget for R&D is, which just means that Indian researchers, if they want to be a part of this, it has to be on a project basis, and they need to find Indian agencies that can fund them to participate in these programs, because India as a whole has not contributed to the overall budget. And so negotiations on getting India on board as a formal partner, as a member state, is, I think, something that captures a lot of headlines, at least, and lots of pillars in which and lots of missions in which Horizon Europe eventually wants to work towards. And so these range from oceans and waters and cancer and semiconductors, biotech, climate change. So there's a lot of this, including digital and energy. But I think we shouldn't be swayed too much by the headlines, because this would be a good to have if Indian researchers can have better people-to-people exchanges and ability to collaborate on tech with European counterparts. But also, this is one thing. I feel there are so many things that India and EU could do better, and they are natural allies in so many different sectors that in some sense the TTC is actually underdeveloped, and we can get into that. And this is related to open source technologies, critical mineral technologies. At least these are what I can immediately talk about. But the areas of collaboration for India and EU are vast, and we have barely even scratched that surface.
Right. Thank you, Shobhankita. That was very interesting. So there are several areas that I think I would like you to weigh in on. And maybe we can start with the concept of tech sovereignty, right? So the first question is, do you think India and EU are sufficiently aligned on the concept of technological sovereignty, or do they understand the idea very differently?
Yeah, I think this is a function of, like I said, the geopolitical pressures between US and China that both parties equally face. And so it's meant to be expanding one's options. And I think to that extent, India and EU understand it exactly the same, in the sense that we want more options. We don't want to be held sort of privy and controlled by the big tech that tends to be American. And of course, there is also the challenge that India and EU don't actually fully align on everything. For example, Russia is a challenge in the sense that the relationship that India has historically held with Russia is a point of concern for Europe, and the fact that Europe treats China as a challenge but not as a threat obviously is something that India doesn't align with, because we obviously have, it's a proximity and geography issue, right? I mean, Russia is waging war closer to Europe.
Yeah.
And China is a country that we have structural fault lines with, border issues with. And so these are, I think, the structural issues that taint this relationship between India and Europe. But it doesn't have to, because there are a whole bunch of things that we can collaborate on without necessarily having the Russia angle or the China angle dictate the terms. So I think to that extent, this relationship will be constrained by the transatlantic relationship and also the Russia-China angle. But it doesn't have to be, and there are a whole bunch of sectors and areas where India and EU are natural allies, like we were talking about, in terms of expanding options and having freedom for choosing, in a sense that proprietary technologies that are controlled by one particular monopoly broadly, or big tech that is governed by the regulations of one country. That doesn't need to taint this. So to that extent, I think there are some challenges and there are some alignments.
So I think overall, you're quite optimistic about the TTC actually helping both India and EU in some way reduce their tech dependence on both the US and China?
Yes, I am. I think there's definitely a shortage of ideas and definitely an implementation stalling happening. But if they were to be more political will behind this, and I hope that the FTA signed early this year will act as that momentum and will sort of push towards that. And if that were to be, then I think there are a whole bunch of things and cooperation ideas.
Right. You mentioned open source tech is one of the areas where you see both of them collaborating. Now, say there is a jointly developed open source infrastructure. Who would be in charge of governance if India and EU do that together? And how would both governments sort of work together, bring in private technology providers, prevent extreme dependence on any particular government? How would that open source infrastructure look like?
So there are many ideas here in the sense that open source by definition ensures that you have freedom, you can choose, you have multiple options. But open source starts firstly with having interoperable standards. And so I would say the first thing, or maybe among the many things that the India and EU can work together, is actually open standards. So let me talk about that just a little bit. For example, technical standards are specifications about how products must be built and how they interconnect, and having standards that are interoperable means that both India and EU can work on the same product and can have more collaboration going on vis-a-vis how the entire tech stack then eventually develops, right? So there is some talk about doing this, for example, in climate, in EV charging infrastructure, in additive manufacturing and plastic recycling. But there can be a lot more that can happen vis-a-vis technology in terms of development of that, right? So open standards and having standards that are underlying, but they also promote competition, and they ensure choice in the market, they ensure efficiency and a level playing field for all stakeholders is one. So just working on interoperable open standards between the two can, I think, really help. And I think there are different reasons that open standards make sense, because firstly, India would want its voice heard in the sense that its interests should be accounted for in the final standards that get approved. And mostly in international standards organizations, we see that it's Western private companies and a lot of Chinese state-funded companies coming over and trying to influence. And in some sense, we don't want our voice to be left behind. And so it's in our interest to ensure that through these mechanisms, we can push for interoperable standards that are actually in everybody's interests. And also, I think digital public infrastructure is a big one, right? India in general has had scale and has had a massive success vis-a-vis its implementation of DPI. And there's a lot that Europe would want to learn from that. And I think there are also structural challenges there in the sense that privacy is a concern that the Europeans have, and they may not trust our code base exactly as it is, or the fact that we iterate so fast that the definition of DPI keeps changing from every time period, right? And so it's this combination of things put together that we call as DPI. And so I think there's a little bit of it's moving too fast. We don't know what exactly constitutes DPI. Do we want to exactly take the code base? I think that's really the concern, even though, and of course, I think there's also some pushback for digital surveillance by the European citizen. And so at the end of the day, they may not want to adopt DPI to the same extent that India has. And also for India, it was a matter of digitization and ensuring access. And so UPI and DPI was all of that very helpful. But, Europeans broadly have sorted out their identity. They already may have credit cards, and so they may not see immediate benefits for having DPI. But I think if it's about choice and improving access and not having proprietary technologies dictate, I think there are learnings that India can provide for the Europeans. And in that sense, I think if it's not the code base, at least the process learning and so on can be sort of transferred between the two. So I think that's what it is, right? So start with open standards, start with looking at interoperability for multiple things, right? Like electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which came out this time in the TTC. Also other kinds of product standards, which is necessary, and also ensure that there are constraints vis-a-vis how technology is perceived by an average Indian citizen versus a European citizen. It's a very different experience, because we have in India leapfrogged several times, and just in the last 15 years, a lot has happened vis-a-vis India's digital economy, and that may not be the pace that a European citizen is familiar with, but I think there are learnings that can still be shared that enable for more to happen.
Correct. Thank you so much, Shobhankita, for those examples. Also, since you've worked quite a bit on critical minerals, I was curious, what is it that both India and EU can specifically collaborate on when it comes to critical minerals, right? We saw something related to battery recycling in this statement, but I think in broad, if you can give our listeners an understanding of whether India and EU have complementary interests when it comes to this area, right? Because after all, there are limited supplies and there is competition for access to those same supplies, right? So, for example, can India and EU, do you see them ever, let's say, creating a joint, reserve, strategic reserve, or some sort of coordinated mechanism for stockpiling of those minerals? What's your view on this?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of things that can be done via international partnerships in critical minerals. But the specific things that you mentioned, which are coordination mechanisms, stockpiling, these are done best when it's more players involved. So it actually makes sense under an umbrella such as the US-led Pax Silica or the Forge, right? So it makes sense when you get more people involved, resource-rich nations, as well as consumer economies, as well as those with great tech capabilities in the sector. But I think vis-a-vis just India and EU, there are a few areas of collaboration that I do want to double down on. One is particularly related to recycling, which is that Europe is big on circularity and they want to double down on recycling as a way of, and in general, recycling is a good thing to do because, a closed loop system is good. And in general, critical minerals are materials, and so they can be recycled and reused. And so it's always better to do that. So I think one is Europe in itself is struggling because many processing and recycling plants, even if they have the technology capability, are actually moving to the US. So there is problems related to environmental regulations, or there's public backlash, or the bureaucratic machinery required to get permits is so slow that, even if they have tech capabilities, there's written record that some of these firms have actually moved to other countries that may be more amenable. And so I think India is a great option for the same, right? I mean, we want to do processing, we want to do recycling. In fact, India is among the world's third largest producers of e-waste. And so it makes sense for us to do a lot more recycling. And it makes sense for these firms with that tech capability to come set up in India. And this is also a moment in time where, because of all of these geopolitical struggles, India can actually ask for more stringent environmental regulations. It doesn't need to be that we are dumping waste and effluents into our local communities. You don't have to necessarily perceive processing and recycling like that, because it's a matter of regulation and also tech enforcement. And if that is done right, I think it'll never be zero environmental externalities, negative externalities, but these can be minimized, and we are in a place where we can do that. And so I think having these plants set up in India and ensuring that these things keep happening, I think that's one way in which India can help. And the other is actually Germany, for example, is among the world's largest importers of permanent magnets, largely because they have this manufacturing base and automation and automobile industry and so on. And so the permanent magnet scheme that India has recently put out, which is trying to capital subsidize for some of these manufacturing facilities to be set up in India, it's actually a perfect partnership in terms of capacity here. The market is there, and we ensure that in the process we can have more collaboration and more tech transfer. So I would say these are immediately what come to mind in terms of bilaterally between India and EU. But I think if there's scope for more ambition, you can, of course, do joint coordination mechanisms, project financing, or project due diligence, even in third-party countries where, which may be resource-rich nations where you can have more mining. Because remember, in both India and EU, mining is a touchy topic. And so if you were to mine in a third country, can you collaborate while you do that? Right? So I think the ambition, if it keeps extending, can extend into third countries. It can extend into a whole bunch of other things. But bilaterally, I see processing and recycling facilities being set up for a market in Europe, and capacity in India is what I see as something that can work.
Right. Thank you so much for giving a very comprehensive picture of what they can actually coordinate on. So on that, Shobhankita, currently we see that the TTC is a ministerial level gathering. It's a political forum ultimately. So how do you think this can be expanded to encourage participation by the private sector, right? Because ultimately all the initiatives also that you mentioned cannot be carried out at the government to government level alone. So what is is the next, let's say, step in advancing the objectives of TTC?
Yeah, right now it's a small forum that meets once a year. And pretty much, if you read the documents that have come out of the three meetings, they look broadly the same except for some changes, which is to say that it needs expansion. It needs more people involved. And I think eventually it makes sense for the TTC to be a coordination mechanism for private sector players to also come in. So it would make sense for the private sector, for startups to come in here, and also to have avenues for funding, for expertise and projects and very specific work going on at a project level that gets folded under the platform that the TTC is. So I think that makes sense. But also between India and EU more broadly, I think talent is one, in the sense that India has a lot of tech talent, and also I think there are bilateral programs for exchange or for students that specific countries, I think France, Germany particularly, run with India. But I think that's one area of collaboration in the sense of talent. And I think the other is we can do other things vis-a-vis, for example, what stops both India and EU from coming up with a open source and not just an open weight LLM? Right now, the best open weight models that we have are Chinese, and that's not a problem. And we've done another podcast exactly on this, saying that that may be also an opportunity for India to hedge with Western compute but Chinese models. But what stops India and EU from co-developing a completely open source and not an open weight large language model? Why can't we come up with an inference chip? Why can't we do more of this together, right? So that's basically the idea, that we have the talent, we have the right opportunity, and we have ideas for what we can do in specific technologies, vis-a-vis, like we said, open source, particularly starting with open standards, but also I think with AI, with open source AI, and also critical minerals. There's natural partnerships vis-a-vis talent possible here. And so I think that's broadly what's possible. The idea is to double down and do more. And this cannot happen if this just remains G2G.
Thank you so much, Shobhankita. I think you also mentioned that the FTA has now sort of infused new momentum in the relationship. I'm hoping that the economic agreement is also helping facilitate the objectives of the TTC, and I think you would agree with that broadly. But I think now I would bring in sort of the larger question of how India views Europe. And it's always been sort of concentrated on Western Europe, with the focus on France, on Germany, Italy, on our Nordic partners. But there is less focus on Eastern Europe. And we saw a change in that this month, where we see India is trying to broaden its engagement by, cultivating its relationship with more strategically situated states. And in this context, it was Moldova, Romania, and North Macedonia. The focus was obviously around tech, but also around education, around business networks, around institutional cooperation. So I just want to quickly give an overview of why these visits, in my opinion, were important, and why we should continue doubling down on these. First, this was the first visit by an Indian head of state to both Moldova and North Macedonia. Romania is a much older partner, but despite that, this was our first sort of high-level visit in 3 decades. And of course, the visit to Romania was the most substantial if we see the outcomes. But I'll quickly go like one by one, right? So I think my takeaway from each of the visits from Moldova, we did something interesting, which was we doubled the number of ITech training places available to Moldovan professionals. So ITech is the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Initiative. It's basically a capacity building initiative that we conduct. And we offered specialized courses in AI, emerging tech. We invited Moldovan diplomats to attend courses on AI and cyber diplomacy at our own Institute of Foreign Service, right? So I think this is an interesting development where we're talking about tech on a very, operational, granular level, but we're also talking about actual knowledge exchange between European and Indian partners. And also Moldova is interesting because it's not officially a member of the EU. It's a candidate country. It opened negotiations with access to EU in 2024. But I think it'll be interesting to see because it's gradually trying to integrate itself in EU's sort of trade and governance structure, right? This may be useful for Indian companies who are also seeking market entry into emerging, European markets. With North Macedonia also, there was a large business forum that I think was quite valuable, at least for the private sector, cooperation bit. And finally, coming to Romania, I think which was the most consequential out of the three in terms of outcomes. Romania, again, is an EU member since 2007. We have very good bilateral trade ties with them, more than 1.5 billion USD, and there are also hundreds of active Indian registered companies that operate in various sectors like IT, pharma, manufacturing. So this was new information for me as well. But in terms of outcomes, I think there were mostly three, and one of them I think holds some importance. So there was a program of cooperation in science and tech, so joint research, collaborative projects on science areas like engineering, health, agriculture. There was an MOU on sports. But I think the most interesting to me was the inauguration of an India Studies Chair at the University of Bucharest, right? Which is supported by the ICCR, Indian Council for Cultural Relations. And I think this is interesting because many European countries are trying to expand their knowledge and understanding of India. And one of the ways to start doing that is having a dedicated country chair, whether in think tanks or academic institutions. To having an India chair at the University of Bucharest, I think is a good move in terms of strengthening our academic and also just cultural engagement, right? So overall, I think the principal achievement from these visits was sort of upgrading our political access in a region that has sort of been under engaged. And obviously capacity building was, let's say, the common thread among them. And it's interesting because capacity building can be seen as a very sort of low hanging fruit, very cost effective for India. But I think it creates some sort of professional relationships between civil servants, between researchers, between technical specialists that ultimately lead to broader, higher level cooperation. These people may also occupy influential positions later, and so I think that sort of helps the relationship overall. So thank you so much, Shobhankita, for that conversation on the EU-India Trade and Tech Council. There was a lot of learning for me because I think this is still something that's very new. And I'm hoping the FTA, if anything, provides a great ballast and scaffolding for this to move forward.
Yeah, thanks so much. And even from what you were mentioning, my takeaway is in every Indian foreign policy statement or visit now, there seems to be a tech involved. So as a researcher in technology geopolitics, that's always interesting to watch.
Yes. Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.